In the previous lecture, we looked at the last pages of the aparalogisms, as well as the first and the second paralogism. In this video, I'm going to skip over the third and start talking about the fourth aparalogism, and at the end we'll say a little bit about the B paralogisms too. So the fourth paralogism of the ideality of outer relation, that is what Kant calls it at A366 in, well, obviously the A version of the book. And what he does in the fourth paralogism, which, like all the paralogisms, gets completely rewritten and in a sense disappears in the B edition. What he does in the A edition is he talks about like Cartesian skepticism about external objects. In the B edition, this entire argument, or an argument that is to take its place, is removed from the dialectic and put in the analytic as the refutation of idealism, which we talked about several videos back. Now, where does it belong, right? Where does Kant's prove that we can be just as sure about external things as we can be about internal things? Where does it belong? In the paralogisms, as Kant thought in the A edition, or in the analytic, as Kant thought in the B edition? Well, there's definitely something to be said for Kant's decision to move it back to the analytic. Because although in a certain sense he is talking about an illusion, right, something that goes wrong in reason, that sort of pushes us into Cartesian skepticism, the end result of the argument is basically a positive claim, right? It is the claim that we can know that there are external objects. And so that would seem to be something that fits the sort of positive story of the analytic better than it does the negative dialectical story of the dialectic. Okay, anyway, here in the fourth paralogism, Kant tackles the Cartesian argument, and he sets it out as follows. That whose existence can be inferred only as a cause of given perceptions has only a doubtful existence, right? And one of the crucial words here is inferred, right? The idea of the Cartesian skeptic is that you cannot immediately, without mediation, without anything coming between it and you cannot immediately know about outer objects. You can only immediately know about inner objects. And then you will have to infer, right, give arguments to support the existence of outer objects as the cause of your inner sensations. And this is doubtful. Right? I mean, you can't, you know, if you have to give these sort of arguments, if you have to make, well, this particular type of inference, which we nowadays would call an inference to the best explanation, right? It's not like a deductive inference, it's an inference to the best explanation where you say, well, I have these inner episodes and the best explanation for that is that they were caused by real things outside me. That's not certain, right? I mean, there might be other explanations, and that is what Kant is going to tell us. Okay, that whose existence can be inferred only as a cause of given perceptions has only a doubtful existence. Now, all outer appearances are of this kind. Their existence cannot be immediately perceived, but can be inferred only as the cause of given perceptions. Thus, the existence of all objects of outer sense is doubtful. This uncertainty I call the ideality of outer appearances, and the doctrine of this ideality is called idealism, in comparison with which the assertion of a possible certainty of objects of outer sense is called dualism. Right? And so idealism here is a thesis that a certain asymmetry, a certain epistemological asymmetry holds between the ideas of inner sense, and we know that those exist, and the kind of stuff that is supposed to be outer, right, where we don't know that it exists. And that is sort of the core tenet of Cartesian skepticism about the external world. So, what is going wrong here, according to Kant? Well, clearly what is going wrong here, I think we can sort of fill in the details, and Kant is going to fill in the details for us in a second. What is going wrong here is that basically the idea of the outer is used in two different senses, right? Because it is true that the existence of outer appearances, well, of outer things, I should probably say, cannot be immediately perceived if by outer things we mean outer in the transcendental sense, right? We mean outer in the sense of, they are not appearances, they are things in themselves, right? We definitely cannot have any immediate grasp of things in themselves, things that are outer in that transcendental sense. So Kant agrees with that. But what he doesn't agree with, so that is one sense of outer. But of course, that's not what the Cartesian skeptic really wants to claim, right? He doesn't want to claim that, we can't have knowledge about things in themselves. Kant would immediately agree with that. But he wants to claim that we can't have knowledge about outer things in the sense of spatial things, things that exist in space. And so we have, Kant says, a sort of equivocation going on here. Right? The second premise, that all outer appearances are of the kind that we can only infer to them, that we can't immediately perceive them, is true if we think of outer as transcendentally outer, but it's not true if we think of outer as empirically outer, as outer in space. Okay, and if we understand that, then we understand what Kant is going to say about different kinds of realism and idealism here. In some pages that, in a sense, it's sad that they were removed in the B edition, because they are quite enlightening about what Kant means with transcendental idealism and how he conceives of the possible choices, the possibilities you can choose between in philosophy. So at A369, Kant makes his distinction between transcendental idealism and transcendental realism. Right? And transcendental idealism of all appearances is the doctrine that they are altogether to be regarded as mere representations and not as things in themselves, and accordingly that space and time are only sensible forms of our intuition, but not determinations given for themselves or conditions of objects as things in themselves. We are, of course, by now well aware of this definition. To this idealism is opposed transcendental realism, which regards space and time as something given in themselves. Okay, so here's what Kant says at the end of that little paragraph. He says, it is really this transcendental realist who afterwards plays the empirical idealist. And after he has falsely presupposed about objects of the senses that if they are to exist, they must have their existence in themselves, even apart from sense, he finds that from this point of view, all outer representations of sense are insufficient to make their reality certain. The transcendental idealist, on the contrary, can be an empirical realist, hence as he is called a dualist. That is, he can concede the existence of matter without going beyond mere self-consciousness and assuming something more than the certainty of representations in me, hence the cogito ergo sum. So what goes wrong in transcendental realism, Kant thinks, is precisely that it conflates outer in a transcendental sense with outer in an empirical sense, right? That it conflates things in themselves with things in space. And if you think that those two things are sort of the same thing, and by the way, I think I put my camera a little bit higher than normally, so let me sort of, yeah, that's better. If you conflate those two senses of outer, or what Kant thinks are two senses of outer, and transcendental realism basically is the claim that those are the same, that like the thing in itself and the outer like spatial thing are sort of the same, then the argument that starts the fourth paralogism seems to be perfectly valid. And it is only once we have achieved the insights of transcendental idealism that we can see what is going on here, that we can see there's actually a conflation taking place here, and that we as transcendental idealists can say, no, the existence of things in space is completely unproblematic. It is no more problematic than the existence of things merely in time, like from inner sense. And so, as a transcendental idealist, I can simply be an empirical realist. I can claim that I know for certain that there are things outside me in the sense of things that are in space. And so Kant says, for instance, this is A371, he says, I am no more necessitated to draw inferences in respect of the reality of external objects than I am in regard to the reality of the objects of my inner sense, my thoughts, For in both cases they are nothing but representations, the immediate perception, consciousness of which is at the same time a sufficient proof of their reality. And in contrast, transcendental realism necessarily falls into embarrassment and finds itself required to give way to empirical idealism. Or really, I would say maybe to add empirical idealism. Okay, what I think we can understand also from reading these pages is why some people thought of Kant as defending a kind of Berkeleyan idealism. Right? Because some of the things that Kant says here, certainly sound like the claim that, spatial objects are just our thoughts. And I mean, space is nothing but our sort of our thought of space. And that's why we can be just as certain about the existence of spatial things as we can be about the existence of like merely temporal things, like my own inner states. And one of the things that Kant tries to do, I would say, in the Refutation of Idealism is rephrase the argument in a way that sort of tries to undercut that kind of reading. Right? And as we have seen in the Refutation of Idealism, Kant tells us that inner sense would not be possible without outer sense. Right? So here he is just saying, they're all appearances, so there's no real difference. In the Refutation of Idealism, he really definitely goes a step further, right, and tells us that we need the representation of outer things, we need these things of outer sense, these spatial appearances, because only there can we find something that makes the time determination of inner states possible, and so inner experience possible. So the Refutation of Idealism definitely gives a different argument and a different kind of argument than the fourth paralogism here, in part probably to undercut these Berkeleyan readings of Kant that popped up immediately after he published the first critique. So Kant spent some time talking about the metaphysical implications of this, right? Because of course one of the things that transcendental psychology is interested in is the relation between like the thing that thinks and the things that are in space. And so we have, for instance, a Cartesian dualism, definitely not the same thing as the dualism that Kant defines here, right? The dualism that Kant defines is somebody who says that there are both inner objects and outer objects exist, but it doesn't really say anything about their deep ontological relation, right? Cartesian dualism is the claim that there's mind and there's matter, and those are the two kinds of substances that form the most basic elements of reality, and they're totally different. Well, we have no idea, right? Kant reminds us at A373 that the transcendental object is equally unknown in regard to inner and to outer sense, right? We don't know what the transcendental object is when it comes to like the material appearances, and we also don't know what it is when it comes to thinking, to these mental episodes. We can't really know. We can't have any theoretical knowledge about how those things relate to each other, right? Whether it's the same thing that is both extended and thinks, or whether they're different things, and so on and so forth. One not unimportant addition, I would say, that Kant makes to this story is at A376, where Kant talks a little bit about illusions, like empirical illusions. So there he says that now cognition of objects can be generated from perceptions either through a mere play of imagination or by means of experience. And then of course there can arise deceptive representations to which objects do not correspond, and where the deception is sometimes to be attributed to a semblance of the imagination in dreams, sometimes to a false step of judgment in the case of so-called sense deceptions. In order to avoid the false illusion here, one proceeds according to the rule, whatever is connected with a perception according to empirical laws is actual. And so what Kant does here is he gives us this rule for deciding what is actually, actual. Like there is, in the way that Kant first sets out the position when he says that we can be immediately aware of objects of outer sense, one might understand that as the claim that outer sense is irrefutable. That's not the word I'm looking for. Like, it can never make mistakes. Indubitable, that was the word I was looking for. That outer sense is always right. Infallible, maybe that's the word I was looking for. Outer sense is infallible, right? If I'm immediately in contact with an object, then surely, like, everything I see must exist. And Kant says, well, no. I mean, there's dreams, right? So sometimes we seem to see things which we don't really see. That's okay, right? I mean, you can claim that we are sometimes in contact, like, immediately with an object, without necessarily claiming that we have infallible marks that are immediately present to know when this is the case and when this is not the case. And Kant has a story about how we make a difference between dreams and real perceptions, which is that the real perceptions form a coherent story when I bring them together, when I connect them with empirical laws. And the dreams do not, right? If I dream that I talked to Kant yesterday, I wake up and I know that it can't be true because I have all these causal reasons to believe that Kant was dead, right? That he has been dead for a long time and that I can't have been talking with a dead person, especially not, I have not actually dreamed about Kant, so let me make something up, especially not given that it was on the top of a pink sugar castle and choirs of angels were singing to us. That doesn't really fit my empirical story of the world. It doesn't fit my other perceptions when I connect them up using empirical laws. And that is the kind of way that we make a distinction between an illusion on the one hand, or a dream, or something like that, and a veridical real experience. So at A379, Kant tells us explicitly that we shouldn't fall into the traps of dualism and monism in the sense that we understand them today, right? These metaphysical positions that say there's only matter, materialism, or there's only spirit, which I guess we would call idealism sometimes, and which Kant here calls pneumatism, or, I don't know, a kind of neutral monism, or a dualism, or, all these kinds of positions that you could take. Why shouldn't we do that? Well, one would take the difference in the mode of representing objects, which are unknown to us as to what they are in themselves, for a difference in these things themselves. If I say, well, a material object just can't be the same thing as a thinking thing, because matter is so different from thought. Okay, I mean, these are very different representations, but we know nothing about the underlying object, about the thing in itself, or the transcendental object. That is what Kant is impressing on us. Now, Kant adds to this an observation on the sum of the pure doctrine of the soul following these paralogisms. And one of the interesting things about this is that Kant tells us a little bit about, like, the practical implications, right? Because one might worry, and certainly some of Kant's contemporaries would be worried, that if you take away these kind of proofs, like the immortality of the soul and stuff like that, doesn't that sort of corrupt people? Doesn't that corrupt morals? And so Kant says a little bit about that, and he says, I think, even more about it, or he certainly says some pertinent things about it in the B version of the paralogisms. So here we have, for instance, at A383. Thereby, of course, I obviously cognize this thinking self no better as to its properties, nor can I have any insight into its persistence, or even the independence of its existence from whatever transcendental substratum of outer appearances there may be, for this is just as unknown to me as the self is. But since it is likewise possible that I may find cause drawn from somewhere else than mere speculative grounds, and here I will reiterate that speculative for Kant means theoretical, so somewhere else than mere theoretical grounds, from somewhere outside of theoretical philosophy. So I may find a cause to hope for an existence of my thinking nature that is self-sufficient and persisting through all possible changes of my state. Much is still won if through the free confession of my ignorance I can nevertheless repel the dogmatic attacks of a speculative opponent, and show him that he can never know more in which to deny my expectations about the nature of my subject than I can in order to hold to them. Okay, what is Kant talking about? Well, what he's telling us that suppose that I have, spoiler alert, I have, suppose that I have reasons not from theoretical philosophy, but from the practical use of reason. That I have reasons to believe myself, for instance, to be an immortal soul, right? To continue living even after my material death. Suppose that I have reasons for that. Well, what the paralogisms have shown me is that nothing in theoretical philosophy can prove me right, but equally, nothing in theoretical philosophy can prove me wrong. Right? So no dogmatic opponent, that is no opponent who has a certain positive body of doctrine that he wants to defend, no such opponent can show me, can deny my expectations about the nature of my subject, because he also can't have knowledge that I am not an immortal soul. Right, so really we see here for the first time, and we're going to see it again in the second and third part of the dialectic, of the antinomy and the ideal, that what reason does, or that what the critique does really, is it shows that we can't know some things by theoretical reason, but that creates room for the practical use of reason to posit and hold on and embrace certain ideas that might be useful and even essential for practical ends. And famously, Kant says that he was forced to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith, right? And this is one of the places where we can see this happening. The same theme appears, for instance, on A394. Okay, so let's move to the B paralogisms. I mean, the main point, of course, of the B paralogisms is the same as that of the A paralogisms. So here is something that is interesting. Let's look at B410 and B411, because there Kant takes, well, actually he doesn't talk about the paralogisms so much as talking about a paralogism, and it's basically the first paralogism of the A edition, and it is supposed to sort of stand in for all the others. So let's look at what's going on there, how Kant explains what goes wrong in this reasoning, what is the paralogism, sort of the problem, the mistake of reasoning that goes on here in rational psychology. The procedure of rational psychology is governed by a paralogism which is exhibited through the following syllogism. What cannot be thought otherwise than as subject does not exist otherwise than as subject, and is therefore substance. Now a thinking being, considered merely as such, cannot be thought otherwise than as subject. Therefore it also exists only as such a thing, that is, as substance. And Kant goes on to say, the major premise talks about a being that can be thought of in every respect, and consequently even as it might be given in intuition. But the minor premise talks about this being only insofar as it is considered as subject, relative only to thinking and the unity of consciousness, but not at the same time in relation to the intuition through which it is given as an object for thinking. Thus the conclusion is drawn per sophisma figurae dictionis, by a sophism of a figure of speech, and hence by means of a deceptive inference. What goes wrong, Kant tells us, is that in the first premise, we are thinking about things like in general, like it is true about things in general that what cannot be thought otherwise than as subject does not exist otherwise than as subject and is therefore a substance. But the second, also essential premise, is only true for concepts, right? For something insofar as it is thought. A thinking being considered merely as such, cannot be thought otherwise than as subject. That might be true, but that just is about how we think about the thinking being, like our concept of the thinking being. Okay, maybe we can only use that as a subject. Doesn't tell us anything about the object that it would refer to, right? And so we cannot apply the first premise, and so we can't really draw any kind of conclusion. And the same mistake, like conflating something thought merely as a concept and something thought as an object, is the mistake that governs all the paralogisms according to Kant. So he spent some time refuting his own friend Mendelssohn's proof of the persistence of the soul. Mendelssohn himself, by the way, he wasn't happy with the critique of pure reason. He famously describes Kant as the all destroyer or something like that, and says that he hopes that there will also rise up a positive Kant, who's basically, whose task would be to undo all the damage that he's done. Kant thinks of it much more positively, right? He thinks that he's making room for faith, that he is like really helping religion and ethics and so on and so forth through his critical project. But well, that wasn't maybe too widely shared. So here is Kant reflecting on that to a certain extent at B421. Thus, there is no rational psychology as doctrine that might provide us with an addition to our self-consciousness, but only as discipline, setting impassable boundaries for speculative reason in this field. So discipline is like, it tells us how to act, right? In order, on the one side, not to be thrown into the lap of a soulless materialism, or on the other side, not to get lost wandering about in a spiritualism that must be groundless for us in life. On the contrary, it rather reminds us to regard this refusal of our reason to give an answer to those curious questions which reach beyond this life as reason's hint that we should turn our self-knowledge away from fruitless and extravagant speculation toward fruitful practical uses, which, even if it is always directed only to objects of experience, takes its principles from somewhere higher and so determines our behavior as if our vocation extended infinitely far above experience and hence above this life. This is Kant telling us that the Critique of Pure Reason, this massively abstract theoretical work, by showing us that we can't find answers to our highfalutin spiritual questions, gives us a hint that our purpose lies here on earth. That is, that we should use our reason for practical ends, right? For doing things, for acting here and now, in which we are gonna find, Kant thinks, although like the main defense of this will have to wait for, let's say, the critique of practical reason, we're gonna find ourselves to be subject to something higher, right? Something that extends infinitely far above experience and hence above this life, which is the moral law that we find in ourselves. From all this, one sees that rational psychology has its origin in a mere misunderstanding. The unity of consciousness, which grounds the categories, is here taken for an intuition of the subject as an object, and a category of substance is applied to it. Here Kant once again, but now in terms of the categories, describes what goes wrong in the paralogisms in rational psychology. We think that our grasp of the subject really is grasp of an object, and that we can apply the categories to it, even though we really cannot. It's not given an intuition. The subject of the categories cannot, by thinking them, obtain a concept of itself as an object of the categories, and so on and so forth. So, finally, after a few more remarks about why he is not really destroying anything of value, and I particularly like what he says at B424, he says, well, not the least bit is lost through disregarding the warrant, or indeed the necessity, for the assumption of a future life in accordance with principles of the practical use of reason, which is bound up with its speculative use. For And here comes Kant's joke. For in any case, the merely speculative proof has never been able to have an influence on common human reason. It so turns on a hair-splitting point that even the schools can retain it only as long as they can keep it standing there, spinning around ceaselessly like a top. A top is a kind of children's toy, right? Which if you spin it, it stays upright, and when it stops spinning, it falls over. So Kant is saying that these theoretical proofs for instance, immortality, like from the simplicity of the substance of the soul or something like that, nobody, like certainly nobody who's not a philosopher, has ever been convinced by that, right? That has never been why people like believed in immortality or were religious or were moral or anything like that. Even the schools can sort of only keep it in mind by ceaselessly keeping it spinning like a top, right? They have to sort of keep talking about it, keep adding reasons or reiterating the arguments to themselves in order to even keep it in mind. It's all powerless, right? It's completely powerless according to Kant. These are empty, bloodless abstractions that do not in fact motivate any of our practical behavior. All right, that is what I wanted to say about the paralogisms. And next we will move to the antinomy, which is Kant's fascinating story about the limits of space and time, about freedom and causation, and about how reason comes into necessary conflict with itself and can only be rescued by transcendental idealism.